affairs at ValoTec. The duration of this webinar is about 1 hour. If you have any question, please wait for the end of this presentation where a dedicated time is allocated for your question. So let me detail the outline of this webinar. In the first part, I will shortly introduce ValoTec and describe our experience. In the second part, I will remind the main requirements of the medical device regulation that was the subject of the last webinar, and which are necessary to understand the, let's say, the philosophy in which has been written both standards we will see today. Then I will address the standards. The standard for the risk management, where I will explain the concept that shows the risk management. And finally, I will speak about the usability standard, where part of the activities are related to the risk management. And in this chapter, we will find an example, an application example of a risk.
Derrière, vous vous souvenez, je vous montre vite le pliage, comme ça vous serez tranquille.
Sorry. Okay. Before we get started, I just would like to inform you that today we have some internet troubles at ValoTec, and I'm using a backup solution. So if you have any issues with the quality of the transmission, please tell me. So let's get started with ValoTec. So ValoTec is a spin-off of the famous French École Normale Supérieure and was created 19 years ago. Our mission is to develop and manufacture devices on behalf of our customers, and more than 80% of our missions are related to medical devices. These missions are performed thanks to our full historic skills that are the electronics, the software, mechanics, and the regulation. Our customers are quite diverse, 30% of large companies and 70% of startups, small and medium enterprises. All our development are stayed in our offices in Villejuif, in the souks of Paris, and therefore our entire staff, about 25%, is gathered here too. We worked on more than 300 projects with all maturity levels, from the idea to the production, but most of the time we complement our customers' team to perform some engineering tasks. And in addition, in strong being ISO 13485 and ISO 9001, we can produce pre-series and small series of devices. Since the beginning, we participated on development of more than 50 medical devices, 15 of which developed from end to end. The devices we worked on were related to various medical areas, such as the urology, the skin treatment, the ventilation, sterilization, and so on. Regarding the complexity of the devices, it goes from the most cost-optimized or battery life optimized device with this cell in drugstore to big medical devices needing high power and including advanced functions such as regulation algorithm, augmented reality, very high speed, internal communication, and so on. We also had the opportunity to work on devices of all risk classes according to the regulations that we discussed at the last session, class 1 to class 3. And it goes from patient-safe diagnostic equipment to intrusive devices such as the neuroimplant or visual regain devices. So now let's have a quick reminder of what we told during the previous webinar concerning the medical devices regulation and the related standard. We said at the last session that the European market is based on the free movement of the goods and the principle of mutual recognition by its member states. To make this possible, the European administration wrote directives and regulation to enforce the manufacturer to manufacture their products according to certain rules in terms of quality of products, workers, environment respect, organization, and so on. The compliance with this text is mandatory if you want to commercialize a product, because this is what allows the free movement of the goods in the European Union. Some of these texts impose to affix the CE marking, which is the case of the medical regulation. We also told that the regulation is organized by sectors, toys, food, automotive, and of course the health, which you can find the relevant regulation for the medical devices, which is the 2017/745. The regulation for this regulation for the medical devices requires the manufacturer to observe the general safety and performance requirements, having two main concerns: being safe for the user and reach the claimed performances. We also told that these requirements are very general topics, and the most appropriate way to justify the compliance with them is using one or several standards. We also told that unlike the regulation of directives, the standards are not mandatory, but as they represent the state of the art of a topic, complying with the standard is the most valuable way to demonstrate the compliance of a device to a technical topic. For each regulation or directive, list of standards are provided on the web page of the related standard of the and or directives you have to apply, and manufacturer must identify within the list of the relevant standard the one they have to apply. When you are considering the medical device regulation, there are several standards that are commonly used. The ISO 3485 for the quality management system, the IEC 60601-1 for the general requirement for basic safety, the IEC 60601-1-2 for the electromagnetic compatibility, the IEC 62304 for the software development, and of course the IEC 62366-1 for the usability, and the ISO 14971 for the risk management, that both are cornerstone of the process of conformity compliance of the medical regulation, and that will interest us today. At last, in this reminder, we said last time that whatever is the medical device developed, the medical devices regulation suggests a workflow which, when not followed, increases the time to market and the development efforts. The first step is to define the claims and the functional specifications. Then you have to apply the regulation requirements, meaning identify the device class, fulfill the manufacturer obligation, identify the requirements according to Annex 1 and associated standard. Then, in a third step, manufacturers have to initiate the various standards, of which the risk management, the usability, and the basic safety, and to identify in there the technical constraints related to their product. With the claim, with the functional specification and the regulatory constraints, the manufacturer can then write the technical specification used to perform the engineering tasks, such as the design or the development or of a proof of concept or a prototype, and up to the integration test. And finally, the device follows the certification process we talked about last time, shown on the right of this slide, and up to the production and the commercialization. So, having these context elements and this workflow in mind, we can now speak about the risk management. Now, unlike some activities related to physical topics, such as the basic safety, the electromagnetic compatibility, or the biocompatibility, which standard provides some construction guidelines, test methods, threshold, or element like this. The risk management is a more, let's say, conceptual activity, which purpose is to anticipate potential failures which could occur or which could result in damages on the user, the environment, or the goods. Risk management is an activity that emerged in the 50s and which was developed during the second half of the 20th century. And this activity is used in all sectors where events could have catastrophic impacts, such as the finance, the avionic, nuclear, etc. And the purpose of this risk management is to prevent against disastrous situations, for example, exposing people to a hazardous situation, or having a financial loss, or environment pollution, etc. And this is based on the understanding of the system and the anticipation of the situations that could occur. In this context, the risk management is widely used in the industry, of which the medical sector, in addition with the technical standard to prevent against damages on the users. It is understood that an absolute safety doesn't exist because no one can foresee all the diversity of innovative devices, anticipate all the possible situations, or predict all the combinatory of the possible events. And moreover, trying to do that would result in an infinite development cost and no device would reach the market. That's why there is always a trade-off between the required safety and the reasonable development costs. And in the medical device regulation, this trade-off is covered by two considerations. The first one is that the risk analysis is a continuous activity that should be handled all along the device life. And the second one is that depending on the risk class of the device, the deepness of the inspection of your technical file and therefore of your risk management file is different. The higher the risk class, the deeper the risk management inspection. Now, there is no normative consensus on an universal way to conduct a risk analysis. Each sector has its specificities and its practice for the risk management. Alors, before diving into the requirements of the standard, let's have a quick review on the most used terms and definition. You can find the useful term and definition in the chapter 3 of the risk management standard, and more broadly, standards always includes definition and often in chapter 3. I would like to insist on the three following one, which are often subject of confusion. The first one is the definition of the harm, which is an injury or damage to people, property, or the environment, meaning that an harm is a physical notion without any consideration of probability. The hazard is a potential source of the harm. This is what may generate the harm. And the risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of an harm with its severity, meaning it is a combination of probability and severity of the harm. And you will see that the way the risk is evaluated follows exactly this definition. The relevant standard for the risk management of the medical devices is the ISO 14071. This standard is especially written for medical purposes, and unlike some other risk management standards, it focuses on the patient safety, while in some other sectors it will focus on cost, delay, reliability, or customer satisfaction. The risk management standard in every sector usually requires that the manufacturer leads 4 main activities called AECR activity. So the A for analyze, this is an activity aiming to consider all the possible events in order to identify the related risks. The E for the evaluation, aiming to determine the criticality of a risk by applying a grade on each risk. The C for the control, which consists in implementing solution to lower or to avoid a risk. And the R for the reporting activity, aiming to record all actions, evaluation, use feedback, etc. Now, the AECR activity is also described in the ISO 14071 with two specificities, an additional concern for the residual risk assessment and another for the post-market survey, but we will see that in detail in the coming next slide. It is important to note that unlike activities such as the software development, for example, it is not required to perform the risk management in the context of a quality management system, even if it is strongly advised that it helps for the various tasks. The reason for that is that the standardization body has adapted its text to countries that doesn't require quality management system. Keep in mind that we are talking about an international standard which is not only used in Europe. The ISO 14971 requires to involve all the relevant staff, starting with the direction. So the direction of the company is responsible to implement an effective and adequate risk management process. We are going to detail, and to do that, the direction shall provide a global orientation of the risk management process, which most significant tasks are, for example, to impulse a policy related to the safety, to hire a competent staff, to plan the activity, to assign responsibilities, to check the adequacy of the risk management process, and to define the priority. These are only common direction tasks. Note also that it is required to evaluate the effectiveness of this process, and to do that, it is required to define acceptance criteria. The global orientation of the risk management process should be detailed and described within a document called the risk management plan. And this document, this is the same thing we just talked about, meaning definition of the responsibility, planification, assessment, and so on. And the execution of the various activities described in this risk management plan is recorded within the famous risk management plan, and it includes, for example, the risk analysis we will see, the identification and the implementation of the risk control means we will see, and the result of all the activities. Now, there is no format required, but proof of the proper execution of each step is requested. So once the risk management plan is ready and the risk management process can start, this risk management process consists in 6 steps, as shown on the figure, including the AECR activity seen previously. So the first step is the risk analysis, which consists, as I said, in identifying the possible failures, hazards, sequence of events, and damages, but we are going to see that in the next slide. The second step is the evaluation of the risk. Then comes the definition of the means of risk control, meanings to take measures to lower the risk level by eliminating an hazard or reducing the probability or the severity of this damage. The fourth step is the residual risk assessment. This is an analysis of the combination of all the residual risk after implementation of control measure, and the risk-benefit balance if unacceptable risk persists. The step 5 is the risk management review. This is the verification that the risk management plan has been properly implemented, that the residual risks are acceptable, and that appropriate methods are in place to monitor properly the production. And the last step is related to the monitoring of the market. As you can see, the risk management activity are a continuous process and must be carried out throughout the product lifespan, meaning that it doesn't end with the positive opinion of your notified body. And also remind that the coming next slide, the concept related to the risk management, and I will give you an application example of the risk identification and the evaluation in the chapter related to the usability. So I just said that the first activity described in the risk management process is the risk analysis. So there is various ways possible to do that. For example, manufacturer thinking, an interview of the expert, use relevant standard, consult public databases. For example, the mode you can find on the FDA website, perform clinical trial, etc. The risk identification shall cover the whole life cycle from the manufacturing, the transport, and up to the end of life of your device. And this task should be performed by a multidisciplinary committee, meaning person having, for example, knowledge of some regulatory task or having a field experience or technical knowledge. And this is for a greater completeness in the identification of the risks. I would like to underline that the risk identification shall continue during the post-market survey based on information collected and reviewed periodically. And the purpose of this is to detect risks that have not been identified during the development. This task of post-market survey may lead to risk reassessment and potentially to an update of the risk control needs. Anyway, this review of the risk analysis should be performed periodically, and any decision or action must be recorded within the risk management file. As I told, the risk identification is composed of sub-activities that we are going to see, such as the identification of the hazards, damages, the sequence of events, and the hazardous situation. So let's see that. First, the identification of the hazard, damages, and victims. It is understood that the hazards have various nature and causes, which are more or less obvious to identify. This is the reason why this activity is performed and reviewed in committee. That said, the fact that the manufacturer has to apply a multitude of standards to meet the requirement of the regulation helps in this identification of the hazard. And moreover, you can find in the Annex C of this standard ISO 971 lists of hazards to help in this identification. Sorry, the text here is in French because we wrote the standard in French. Then comes the identification of the situations, including cause and sequence of events leading to hazardous situations. Once more, hazardous situation depends on the context and have multiple origins. That's why it is advised to detail the sequence of events. We will see an example in the chapter related to the usability. Please note that some failure or identified situation may not lead for sure to an hazardous situation, but whatever its criticality, all the situations should be recorded. And likewise, for the hazard, you can find in Annex C of the standard ISO 14971 list of examples to help in the identification of the situation. The table is also in French. Once a first iteration on the risk analysis is done, including the hazard, victim, damage, sequence of events, and the hazardous situation, the standard requires to perform the evaluation of these risks. So this evaluation of the risk should be performed according to two parameters, which are the severity and the occurrence. So note that this matches exactly with the definition provided for the risk. So let's get started with the severity. So the first thing to understand is that there is no universal scale to assess the risk level, and therefore this assessment should be argued using the literature, using available statistics or your experience. The assessment of the severity can vary depending on the victim, if it is a person, goods, or the environment, or depending on the situation, and therefore it is advised to consider separately all victims and the situation, and broadly the combination of both victims and situations. Also, Note the difference between the safety, which is the capacity of the system being free to unacceptable risk, and the security, which is the capacity of the system to resist to an unwanted entrance. Both should be evaluated in the risk management, and a focus on the security is always greater. Also note that the risk evaluation is performed twice, as described in the risk management process shown earlier. The first evaluation is done before the implementation of the risk control mean and correspond to the step risk evaluation, and the second one after the implementation of the risk control mean during the step risk control mean. After the assessment of the severity, you have to assess the occurrence of the risk, and this is based on the probability of each event composing a situation, in addition with the one of the hazardous situation. It is essential to detail as much as possible the sequence of events to ease this assessment of the occurrence. And the standard suggests to multiply the probability of each event to get the probability, the overall probability of the risk. As well as for the severity, there is no universal scale for the occurrence, and it's up to you to justify according to your experience and the literature your notation. The occurrence should be quantified as well as the severity as much as possible on objective basis. And this task is not an easy one because such probability on the occurrence are often missing. But you can find some elements in the literature. For example, the standard IEC 6479 related to the effect of the current on human indicates that an electrocution with a current of 50 milliamps for 1 second can have disastrous effects in 50% of the case. So you can find some elements like this. Once both the occurrence and the severity have been assessed, they are merged to get a unique indicator of the risk, which is the criticality. There is no requirement on how to get the criticality from the occurrence and the severity, and it's up to the manufacturer to define the most suitable way. Usually, the result of the occurrence, which is a duration or a frequency, and the result of the severity, which is notation of the damage without defined unit, are both converted on a scale, usually from 1 to 5, and multiplied together to get a criticality result from 1 to 25. Also, an unclear unit related to the severity of the damage per unit of time. The scale of the occurrence generally is a logarithmic one to his understanding of each level. This means that, for example, moving from one level to another is equivalent to multiply the occurrence probability by 10. And concerning the severity, the scale is qualitative most of the time and can be, for example, 1 is a kind of discomfort, 2 an impairment less than 1 day, 3 an injury requiring a medical intervention, 4 an injury requiring several months for fully recovering, for example, and 5 a permanent injury. And depending on the criticality result, occurrence, for example, multiplied by the severity, the risk is considered as acceptable or not. All the risk should be decreased down to an acceptable level using the risk control means. But if not acceptable risk remains, then the benefits risk balance is assessed by your notified body in regard of the advantages provided by your device, for example, on medical treatment, or a more reliable diagnostic, or a disability compensation, or treatment like that. I just said that the manufacturer must reduce all risk to an acceptable level. You can find in the standard the term as far as reasonably possible, but remind that you must decrease the risk to an acceptable level. Please note that the standard does not define what is acceptable. It's up to you as a manufacturer to do this based on your internal policy, based on ethical consideration, or depending on the user or the environment in which the development is deployed. To reduce the risk to an acceptable level, we said that the manufacturer should implement risk control means, and the standard identifies three types of risk control means. The first one is by inherently safe design or manufacture. Two is by protective measures, either in the medical device itself or in the manufacturing process. And three is providing information for safety and, where appropriate, training to the users. These three means are detailed in the standard, but these are a so significant concern that they have been introduced in the regulation itself, and you can find them in the requirement 4 of the Annex 1. Now let's detail these three risk control means. Donc, inherent safety by design is performed using measures such as specific connectors that cannot be connected in the wrong way, for example, designing the shape of the device to prevent against bad positioning, by limiting the number of control of the user interface to prevent against bad sequences, by limiting the output level of a signal to prevent against bad control settings. Protective measures could be an alarm system to indicate failure, for example, a detection system that stops the device if parameter exceeds their acceptable ranges, for example, mechanical guards protecting users against moving parts of a device. And at last, information for the safety could be a warning provided within the user guide, a label applied on the device, or a training to avoid use error. The risk control means should always be implemented in this order: 1 by design or manufacture, 2 by protective measures, and 3 by information. And this is justified in the standard by the fact that inherent safety is probably stronger, more effective, and more reliable. And furthermore, the experience shown that even the well-designed protective element or measure may fail, and that the safety information may not be followed. But we are going to see that we have example in the usability chapter. This table here is a typical risk management table you can meet with a small variation in plenty of projects. This table, we are going to detail, summarize all the notion we discussed up to now. So in the first column, you have a risk number you can use for your traceability. The second column is the life cycle where the risk can occur. The third one describes the hazard. Then you have the sequence of events. The column 5 is related to the hazardous situation. Column 6 indicates the victims that should be considered. Column 7 gives the damage for the victim. Then you have an optional column for mitigation and pre-evaluation, which is rarely used, but it is interesting as it can provide already existing or by default mechanisms, considerations, structure, or practices impacting the risk level. Then you have the 3 columns for the occurrence, severity, and criticality we explained previously. Next come a column allowing to highlight a risk to be mitigated. After that, there is the column for the risk control means, and then you have the post-mitigation notation. The last one indicates if a risk arises from the risk control means. The assessment of the severity should be performed according to the description provided in the column damage. And the assessment of the occurrence should be performed according to the description of the current sequence of events and the one of the hazardous situation. Sometimes you can find some specific rules related to the risk assessment coming from other standards. And for example, the probability related to software failure should be maximum before mitigation, but we will have the opportunity to speak about that in a coming next webinar. Finally, concerning the risk analysis, I would like to highlight that the ISO 14071 describes the activity that should be performed in the risk management, but it doesn't provide the recommendation on the manner to perform these activities. Nevertheless, Annex B provides several techniques that can be used for the risk analysis, such as the FMEA, the PRA, ASOP, and so on. And the technique to be used depends on your corporate culture, on the device class, and the phase of the development in which is the device. Some techniques such as the preliminary risk analysis, aim to identify the risk control needs from the hazardous situation. And this technique allows to draft quickly a risk analysis and is suitable in the early stages of your project when your device is not developed to get a raw idea of the risk control needs that could be required. At the opposite, the famous failure mode and effect analysis, the FMEA, aims to decompose the device in sub-elements and to assess the consequence of the failures of each single element. And this technique is very detailed and more suitable when the device is in more advanced development phase. I will not develop here the 5 techniques presented because I think the interest of this webinar is limited, but I summarized them in this presentation so you can get them easily if you need. So now we have completed the section related to the risk management. Let's speak about the usability. So you will see that part of the activities required should be performed in the context of the risk management, and we will apply the concept seen to the study of the usability of a cochlear implant. We all heard those stories of a doctor operating a patient wrong legs with nurse writing on the LC1, and this type of error probably always exists, but with the emergence of increasingly sophisticated devices, and especially the ergonomics have not been properly sorted out, some dangerous situations due to misuse have multiplied to the point that the legislator had to update the regulation with this concern. I can give you 2 examples. The first one takes place in 2011, where the FDA recalled the software system leading doctors to confuse the left and the right side of the brain when evaluating patients before surgery. And the second one is also a recall concerning a glucometer, which display was not readable enough and lead some user to interpret, for example, the number 2.2 as 22. And as a result, the user mistakenly believed they need to adjust their insulin, proceeding to unnecessary injections. This is to prevent, again, some hazardous situation like this that the IEC 62366 related to the usability has been written. This standard requires the manufacturer to design and to test its device, having in mind the way the device will be used, and to match its user interface with the mental model of the users. The standard defines 3 types of views shown on the figure. The first one in green is a correct use, and I think it is not necessary to explain. Second one in red is an abnormal use with the idea of a consensus on willful bad use. And the third one is an error of use in orange, where the improper use is not wanted by the user, but because the user interface is misunderstood, for example. It is obvious that the user interface must be designed to favor a correct use, and that the abnormal uses can hardly be avoided. We can illustrate that saying that it is always possible to cut off a finger with a knife, even if the knife is not initially intended for that. The purpose of the standard is to limit or to avoid the error of use. The orange one. And to do this, it considers the user and the environment where the device is installed. The standard also requires to develop the user interface in the context of the development cycle to ensure that this consideration of the users and the environment are properly implemented and effective. The standard details the three types of error of use, the orange one. The first one is the cognitive error due to the tiredness, for example, stress, mental load, which may lead the user to make mistakes with a device that are not very intuitive. We have to imagine the multitude of devices that the nurse has to verify in the patient environment at the hospital, for example. The second type of error is error interpretation. For example, when using a green LED to indicate an error, when usually a red one is expected. Other example is a confusing commands because of the complexity of the user interface, or where, for example, a power outlet is used for something else than the main power. And the third type of error of use is manipulation error. For example, when the user has difficulty saying the instruction because the screen is too small or the font is not correct, or when user has to carry heavy loads and such situation like that. The IEC 62366 standard mainly addresses these issues and requires the medical devices manufacturer to anticipate them and to design the devices to limit the foreseeable misuse. Now, the standard IEC 62366 doesn't provide guidelines or technical tests related to your user interface, but it requires to implement a development cycle in the same mindset than the one used to develop a software, for example. We are going to see this development cycle in detail, but for now, let's consider this standard as a black box. As input, the usability study takes the functional specification of the device, including the intended the famous use case, and the description of the users and the environment. As output, the usability study provides the following elements. The usability file, the risk analysis related to the usability, the specification of the user interface, the usability test reports, formative and summative evaluation, and of course, the user interface itself. If we open the black box to see what lies within, we can see that the heart of the standards is in chapter 5 and is made up of 10 clauses describing 10 development steps. To ease the understanding, we have to keep in mind that these 10 clauses can be grouped in 3 main activity families. Clause 5.1 to 5.5 are activities related to the use analysis and the risk identification. Clause 5.6 to 5.8 are activities related to the specification and design of the user interface. And clause 5.8 again to 5.10 are activity related to the evaluation of the user interface. This groupment is a roughly idea, but it can be summarized like that. We can recognize here the shape of the development method with specification, implementation, and test at the end. So let's detail the 10 clauses of the usability development process. So the first step, corresponding to clause 5.1, requires the manufacturer to specify the use. It includes the patient profile, detailing medical indication, the population, contraindication, etc., the practitioner, its specialty, skills, and so on, the environment where the device is set up, and a short description of how the device is used. From the functional specification, where the use case has been described, and the result of 5.1, the manufacturer must identify the characteristics of the user interface related to safety. I repeat, the characteristic of the user interface related to safety, and this is the clause 5.2, and these characteristics can be, for example, the characteristics able to be hazardous, as an example, hot accessible part, sharpened edge, and characteristics like this. There is also characteristic allowing to reduce the risk, the famous risk control means we discussed in the risk management part, and the characteristics that can mislead the user, confusing command, poor ergonomics, etc. For example, some characteristics related to the safety we already talked about in this webinar are confusing LED. If you use a grid LED as when a red one is expected, confusing sequence of command, bad readability of the display. The 2.2 you can interpret as 22 and stuff like that. The Annex C of the ISO 14071 details the sequence of events, some example of this characteristic of user interface related to safety. And in addition, with the identification of the user interface characteristic related to safety, the manufacturer should identify the possible error of use possible. The 3.1 we talked about a few slides ago. If we link this part with what we saw during the risk management section, we realize that the identification of the safety characteristics of the user interface are the events composing the sequence of events, and the use error corresponds to the identification of the hazard. So the table here is the risk management table of the cochlear implant. So this is an implant that people with severe hearing loss have to access to sounds. So in the table, I just give you two examples. In the first line, it is considered that if the battery level is confusing, it may result in a perception error. The patient thinks that the device is power supply while it isn't, leading, for example, to a civil accident. For instance, if the device stops, if it stops listening in the middle of the street and the patient doesn't hear an arriving car, for example. And in the second example, it is considered that if the position of the buttons are too close, a patient will decrease the sound level, could increase it instead, typically a manipulation error, and the patient may be surprised because the surrounding sound are too loud and it may generate a domestic accident, for instance. Then comes the clause 5.3, and this clause requires to identify the hazardous phenomenon and the hazardous situation arising or mitigated by the user interface. Once more, if we link with the risk management, we realize that this corresponds to the identification of the hazardous situation. If we reuse the two previous examples, we realize that the hazardous situation would be civil accident and domestic accident. The clause 5.4 requires to identify and to describe the use cases related to the hazardous phenomenon. This activity corresponds to the identification of the sequence of events if we take the point of view of the risk analysis. To be as accurate as possible, good practice is to involve the end user for these descriptions. So if we reuse the two previous examples, the scenario of both situations are detailed in the sequence of events, as I said, and to complete your risk analysis, it only remains to fill the current damage, allowing to assess the severity. And this is also required in clause 5.4. Clause 5.5 requires to select the scenario to be tested in summative evaluation, only summative evaluation. I will detail the difference between summary and formative evaluation in a few slides. The selected scenarios are the ones described in the sequence of events and related to unacceptable risks, which mean that the risk having scores exceeding the acceptable threshold you define in the context of your risk management process. In the previous example, the risk with the manipulation error leading to a domestic accident is considered as not acceptable, and therefore this risk should be tested in summative evaluation. Of course, when there is no risk related to use and considered as not acceptable, summative evaluation is not required. Clause 5.6 requires the manufacturer to specify the user interface. So, keep in mind that the user interface is not limited to the device control, but also include all the elements that can interact with him, such as the casing, the handles, the labelings, and even the user guide. The specification of the user interface must take into account the identified scenario, but above all, and this is the purpose of the standard, the risk of use. Some example of user interface specification will be the size, the color, and the font of a labeling, the size and the spacing between two buttons, the disabling of an auto scale on a displayed curve in a graph, the number and the color of LED monitoring a battery charge, etc., etc., etc. Clause 5.7 requires the manufacturer to establish and maintain an evaluation plan for the user interface. There is two types of tests defined in the standard. As I said, formative evaluation and summative evaluation. The formative evaluation is mandatory and aims to verify that the user interface works as expected, that the users understand the user interface, and to verify that there is no unexpected user that has been missed. The formative evaluation can be performed by the manufacturer using a simulated device. It is not required that is the final device. Simulated device is enough, but by representative users. On its side, the summative evaluation is mandatory only if the risk analysis demonstrates that some risks related to the user interface are not acceptable, and the summative evaluation aims to demonstrate that the user interface is safe. It should be performed on the final device by the final users in an environment as close as possible to the final one. Whatever, if the test is formative or summative, manufacturer have to record the following elements. The goal of the test, the part of the user interface to be tested, the evaluation methods, and if it provides tangible proof, and the test protocol, including the definition of the user, the environment, and a justification that the conditions are sufficiently representative. Clause 5.8 is related to the design and describe the test for the formative, and the test according to the formative protocol defined previously. Of course, the design should follow the specification and consider the output of the risk analysis. I advise to design the user interface as simple and refined as possible. Your design should prevent against complex combinatory that should guide, let's say, as much as possible a user to a single safe way to use device. Also avoid too innovative interface because most of the time they are counterintuitive. The manufacturer can set up in this concept in the context of this article training to help to use the device safely, but I advise to set up this training only at last resort because it increases significantly the documentation level, and you have to provide evidence that the users have been properly trained. This training is suitable for complex devices used by a specialized practitioner, but not for the device used by a layperson at home, for example. Our caution, the design process works in closed loop. If some unexpected error of use are revealed during the formative test, then you have to update the risk analysis, the specification, modify the design, and replay the test. So let's detail a little bit more how is driven a formative evaluation. So according to our experience at ValoTec, you have to hire between 5 and 10% to make your test relevant. 6% seems to be a kind of magic number. We already said that the device and the environment can be simulated, but the person tested have to be representative of the final users. The scenario of the test should be defined accurately. Each test should indicate the function under test, the expected behavior of the participants, and the acceptance criteria. And even the behavior of the mediator and the oral instruction should be defined accurately and should be the same for all participants. Clause 5.9 describes summative evaluations that should be performed to test all the hazardous scenarios identified in clause 5.5 and using the test protocol defined in 5.7. So unlike the formative test, this summative evaluation is focused on the risks and should be performed using the final design in the most realistic conditions possible. If unexpected hazardous situations are identified, then same thing that for the formative evaluation, manufacturer should update the risk analysis, the specification, modify the design, and replace the test. So let's have a word on how is designed the summative evaluation. The test is performed roughly in the same way as the formative evaluation with quite the same document patterns. The number of participants depends on the occurrence of your risk, the one used for the evaluation in your risk analysis. For example, if in your risk analysis your notation indicates an occurrence lower than 10%, then your participant population should be sized in consequence. But at least 15 participants are required. Acceptance criteria should be defined to answer the question: is the user interface hazardous or not, and does the user interface be reviewed or not? At last, the standard introduces in clause 5.10 the notion of user interface of unknown provenance, which remind the notion of software of unknown provenance we can meet in the IEC 62304 related to software developments. User interface of unknown provenance are user interfaces that have not been developed for medical devices, but used in medical devices, meaning user interface that do not have documentation or are not developed in the context of a development cycle. Some example of user interface of unknown provenance are, for example, the LED you have on a charger, for example, or the battery gauge display on the Android where a medical software is running. When you have a user interface of unknown provenance, you have to follow activities. The first one is to write the specification as required in 5.1. Second one is to examine the post-production data of your loop. Then you have to identify the hazardous situation arising for your user interface of unknown provenance. After that, analyze the risk management file, in your risk management file, the usability related to the interface of unknown provenance. Implement risk controls until the risk level is acceptable. Maybe it's not required if your user interface is safe. And at last, evaluate the residual risk of related to your risk, user interface with the risk control means. So we completed the chapter of the usability and this presentation. I would like to end this presentation reminding you the main elements seen in this webinar and even in the previous one. So first, the regulation is a 2017/745. It is mandatory when developing a medical device, and the risk management and the usability are part of its requirement. Then you can use the standard ISO 14071 for the risk management, and this standard requires to analyze, evaluate, control, and document your risks during your risk management process. And finally, the standard for the usability is the IC 62366 and requires to identify the risk related to the device use and to reduce them until an acceptable level following a development cycle of your user interface. Finally, I strongly advise to start all these activities early in your project to prevent against a wrong trip in the design of your device. This is an engineer that said that. I thank you for your attention, and I will try to